for joining. Hopefully this will be useful. I shared a Google Doc in the chat. We're going to do a few activities moving along just to get you thinking about writing. And so we'll please open the Google Doc so you'll have that when we get to that point. Okay. So since this is really the first module where we've actually covered any aspects of communicating science policy, I wanted to just start with a broad overview of why this is important and how you should think about communicating policy. I'll be talking in this module mostly about communicating your research, which is building off of your previous module where we talked about research policies. And as I mentioned, we'll have the Google Doc in which we'll brainstorm a little bit of writing exercises. So in general, in terms of communicating science policy, many elected officials don't have a scientific background, so they rely on experts to provide input. Importantly, this input needs to have a balanced view in terms of both pros and cons of a particular policy. And it should also be evidence-based to establish your legitimacy and trust as a scientist to the policymakers. And one thing to keep in mind is that policy moves fast, and so you're not going to have a lot of time to think about and synthesize information, which is different from when you're a scientist and you have a lot of time to think about that. So we're going to practice that a little today, just thinking on your feet and seeing what you come up with. Then, so that's good to keep in mind. In addition to being able to quickly come up with information, you should also be writing something that's relevant to how your audience operates and what their needs are. And this depends on who it is and what setting they work in and how they think about that particular policy. And also it should tell a story with a compelling narrative that is also backed by data. So it's important that it's evidence-based, but also needs to flow into a nice story. So here are some things to consider when communicating with policymakers. Policymakers are busy people. They are all bombarded with a lot of information all the time. So when you present them with evidence, it needs to be synthesized, framed, and tailored to the ways in which they understand this information. And this sort of goes both ways in terms of the evidence, but also appealing to their emotional side. So a lot of times they'll be more receptive to what you're saying because there's a personal story involved. And there's actually a paper that I put at the end of the talk around psychology and policy studies. So there's actually a study looking at how policymakers respond to both data and sort of the personal side. There's actually a paper on that. The other thing to remember in a real life situation is that the timing of your communication is also critical in terms of what's going on in the federal landscape at the time. And so what you're talking about needs to be relevant to what they're looking at or thinking about in federal policy. However, a lot of times you don't want to be approaching them sort of waiting for the perfect timing, because as I said, things move quickly. There's not really a perfect time to engage. It's gonna be a process of where you will sort of give your pitch and then ideally work with them to develop a policy over time. So it's really a process that needs to start sooner, and you can work together on developing policy. And finally, you need to engage with real world policymaking. So you might think about, you can write about things that you're interested in, but at the same time, being aware of what's going on in the real world, current issues that they might think about, and making your communication relevant in terms of sort of federal policy as well. So you need to know what they're thinking about and discussing and debating in their office in terms of what's going on federally. So just keep what you're talking about relevant to the rest of policy. So these are 3 key questions to ask yourself anytime you communicate with policymakers. The first is, who is my audience? Who is this for? What are their interests, and what is their knowledge on the topic? And you need to know what issues they're currently discussing, and consider also actionable solutions to problems. So it's good to present the policy and the issue that you want to talk about, but also come up with solutions to how you think the problem should be solved. And this, it's important to also keep this in the context of their constituency, because they're gonna care about what the constituents have to say. And second thing, your message has to be framed for a particular audience. So it needs to be accessible, relatable, and meaningful. So this is gonna depend on who you're talking about and what they care about. And answer this question of why should I care, which is really the bottom line of how policy communication starts. In contrast to academic writing, you really need to put the bottom line first and let them know why they should care about what you're gonna say, and then write that out in detail. So we'll go through this later. And finally, the medium that you'll use to communicate your message. So at least throughout this course, we'll be talking about both speaking and writing about science, which requires different skills and structures in the way you're presenting your policy. Okay. So right now, we're gonna do a little quick activity in the chat. You can write your answers under each question. It's just a sort of a crowdsourcing activity to see what the group comes up with under each question. Thinking about what you want to write your piece on, who you want to write it for, and what message it is. So we'll take just about 5 minutes and then summarize a couple of the answers when we come back. All right, so keep these in mind as we'll go through and keep thinking about your pitch. So one thing to think about is how you want to frame your message. So this is, I thought it was an interesting guide from Brown in terms of different modes of communicating and how sort of where the gap is and how you fill that. So one way is to think about this as the deficit model, which assumes public skepticism about science, which is caused by lack of relevant knowledge. And this is where scientists share their knowledge with the public. So you would actually inform about some scientific topic that they may have less knowledge about. The contextual model is where you put yourself in the audience's shoes and think more about their needs, attitudes, and existing knowledge on the topic. And the participation model is where you engage the policymakers in debates. And this can happen in public forums, town halls, etc. And so I think I think these are three really different ways of thinking, but when you're writing your pitch, it's also good to keep all these three in mind, because you're essentially doing all of these things. So you're going to share some knowledge that they don't know because you're the science expert. You're going to put yourself in their shoes and try to understand how they think about this issue and how they're going to see what you're saying. And also they're going to participate in, if you're able to actually engage with them early on and participate in the policy that you're developing, you're actually going to do all three of these. So, but there may be different writings where you may be doing more of one or the other. So it's a good thing to keep in mind in terms of communication models. Okay, so now we're going to move into writing specifically. So you've probably seen this before, but just to remind you again, so you need to use active verbs as well as analogies and examples. So obviously not very technical writing, avoid jargon, euphemisms, cliches, wordplays, and puns. Include details in your story, but only if they're critical to what you're saying. So you don't want to make it too involved. You want to keep your story true to the facts. So always remember to keep it evidence-based. And make sure to start with an outline and prepare to have it edited and revised and rewritten several times. But I think some people start writing and don't think about this. So it's really important to have a plan and what the outline is going to be before you start. And always cite your sources as well. If you can, that's important too. So I've alluded to this already before, and you've probably seen this diagram before in terms of how policy writing differs from academic writing. So academic writing is very much starting with the background, followed by supporting details, and then results and conclusions. And policy writing sort of flips this around to where you start with the bottom line, answer the question, so what, why do I care? And then add supporting details. So this is something to remember. If you remember nothing else from today, this is the sort of critical point of how you should think about your writing, and that sort of flips around the academic writing, starting with the bottom line first. Okay. So here, I just want to show you sort of the the breadth of the different types of write-ups that you can have. And this is taken from the JSPG submission guidelines, which has more information and examples as well. So I encourage you to check that out. But what you can see here is that there are a lot of different types of write-ups. So they vary in length, purpose, as well as some of them have executive summaries. Some of them do offer policy recommendations, not all of them. Some of them influence decisions, whereas others are more balanced. And so we'll go through that. And today we're going to talk about 3 different ones: the policy memos, which are essentially offer analysis and recommendations for a particular audience regarding a particular situation or problem. So you would have an executive summary and direct it at a specific individual or organization. So this can even be an internal memo to your organization. And it's usually a pretty balanced view in that you want to have both sides of the sort of pros and cons of the policy here. In contrast, the oped, which is also 2,000 words, you can see they're both about the same length. This would express your own opinion in a newspaper or other avenue and tie that to the policy or governance implications. And so there are also other types here you can read about. And the white paper, which we're also going to talk about, is a longer write-up, 6 to 8 pages, which also argues for a specific position or solves a problem to the audience and is also aimed at influencing decisions. So again, there's really different types of writing, and you're probably going to encounter all these in your policy career, but we're just going to cover a few today. So we'll start with policy memos. So these are usually written for by policy advisors, advocates, or everyday citizens who are seeking to effect change in the community. And this is something that, it's pretty broad. So you may, again, maybe be related to different audiences. The important thing is that to remember is that they're used to analyze an issue and offer recommendations to inform and guide the decision maker. And so this is often a policymaker. It can also be used for the public. And typically this is for individuals that don't have a science background. They're intelligent, but they're uninformed on the particular topic. And so you're sort of the expert who's going to tell them about the science that you're talking about. And so they need to be really direct. So as I mentioned, they're directed at specific individual or organizations. And they need to be specific and consistent, as well as avoiding jargon or highly academic language. And objectivity is really important. You want to convince a decision maker of a certain policy, but also you want to think about both the strengths and the weaknesses of all policy options. And keep it brief. As we said, policymakers are busy and they need a concise memo, which they can quickly glance and understand what the issue is and what your position is. They won't have time to read more than 1 page. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through now this example of a policy memo, just to go through the executive summary in the interest of time, but typically the piece itself would essentially sort of unpack all the same order of issues, going from the background all the way to the limitations and barriers. And so as I said, just remember these are for individuals, organizations, or particular decision makers, and they're very clear and to the point, and follow this structure of sort of what do we know, what do we recommend, what the limitations are of the study, and then barriers to that particular policy and conclusions. So they need to be very concise and weigh both sides of the policy, looking at both strengths and weaknesses. And so in this particular memo, so typically the way it would look, you would have a header and a summary, and would start with a background, which in this case, for example, it says, talks about non-human animals that have been a long-standing model for biomedical research. And this justifies animal experimentation to an extent. And however, there's also evidence that these models may not be necessarily useful. So there's a lack of predictive utility of animal models for human disease. So it brings up sort of the background and the context that's framing the argument that they're making. And the evidence that they're going to use, this is sort of the meaty part of how you're going to back up the argument with data. So I won't read that, you can read that. And then what they're saying is that they recommend, based on this data, that NIH expand its efforts to improve the translatability of this research through establishing the model human initiative. So it's a pretty basic structure in terms of what the background is. It's backed by data and then the recommendations that they're making. So typically this would then have also alternatives to the policy, as well as limitations and barriers to the policy that they're proposing. And so that's not here in the summary. So this is actually what we're going to do now, is based on this, think about what alternatives you see to the policy that's proposed here and potential limitations and barriers. And I'll leave this up. Let me go back to leave it up for you.
So they're going back to the same document. Okay. There was one question while you were presenting, Adriana. It was, can my audience be all stakeholders, or is just the policymakers? I'm not sure where exactly, what point it was relevant to, but do you have anything to say about that, Adriana?
So it can be for different stakeholders, but you would write it differently. So if you're writing about the same topic for the public versus policymakers, and as we saw in the previous question, if you're writing for somebody who works on health policy versus drugs or something else, the framing will be different. So I think you can write for different audiences, but then you have to frame it to, as I said, kind of what their interests are too.
Mm-hmm. And Adriana, we'll be sharing these slides at the end of the session, right, with the recording? Oh, if they get the recording, then the slides will be there.
Yes, I can share the slides.
Sure, thank you.
So if you can read these answers would be great, because I can't see the.
Oh, okay, sure. So the first part, what are the alternatives to policy proposed in the memo? There are the ones which are finalized so far are conventional energy sources are high in carbon emissions and have negative impacts on the environment. And there's things about developing an in silico infrastructure supercomputers to predict efficacy of drugs in humans. And divesting the funds from other departments or interrelated agencies to nanotechnologies, as well as achieving the best result possible. Let's see, what's the other one? Animal experimentation. The pressure NIH to use non-mammalian model systems that are still translatable to human research, but not as much of an ethical challenge and more cost effective. And then we have asked for additional funding to ensure that there is more STEM resources for children who are in public education. Create more human-like systems such as organ on chip. That's cool. not actively incorporating questioning skills in school curriculum, which can affect students' inquiry skills. Okay, alternative policy memo proposed. So then I'll move over to the limitations. We don't have time to read everything, but those look really good. Some of the limitations and barriers of the policy in the memo: model human creating could pose a lot of ethical risk, as we see for AI initiatives. Lack of funding to promote research for novel technologies, political will to increase funding in science and tech, difficulty in certain current institutions and research labs to switch to non-animal models, high regulations and requirements in humans, then funding availability for the initiative, barriers that public education is typically underfunded due to local taxes and lack of funding at the state level. So money will be an issue when trying to reformat education. Human studies could take longer for approval, etc., potentially slowing the research process. Slow new drugs and health technology development, lack of financing for novel, untried path or electrification of pathways. Human models are expensive and ethical concerns are more complicated. Okay, some people are even on to part 3. That's awesome. Yeah, that's the majority of them. Can you see the document, Adriana, now?
No, I don't want to switch now because I'm sharing just the slide portion.
Oh yeah, that's right. That's right.
You
Yeah.
can read.
I'm the one with like 5 screens here. Okay.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, those are really good. So thank you for that. I think what that points to is that there's no real one right answer. So you all came up with a bunch of different alternatives here that are likely to be right. And I think this is also different from scientific writing, where you sort of are used to kind of one answer being the right one. But here's, you can be creative and think about what alternatives, limitations, and barriers might be. And I realized that you didn't have time to read this beforehand, but that's kind of a test, because a lot of times in policy, that's how it is. You get something and you have to turn it around quickly. So it's kind of a good exercise for you to think about this in the spot. Okay, so we'll move on to opeds. So opeds are slightly different in that, in contrast to the memos, which are very exact and almost balanced, opeds are written more like a prose, and they express particular opinions of an author that can be more biased or one-sided. So you're actually expressing your opinion on one side, and also the style is different from the memo. And they're typically published by newspapers or magazines, and the opinion of the author is typically not necessarily affiliated with the publication's view. But they have been shown to actually affect both the view of the public and policymakers. And so I put a paper at the end that you can read, that opeds actually do change opinions of people. So as you might imagine, this is a little broader than memos, and so they can be written by business executives, scientists, school kids, local citizens, etc. So it's really, because they can be published in a lot of different avenues. And they're very helpful for getting your point of view out in a visible way. So this is something that you can practice on, and is a helpful skill to do when you're starting out in policy. They are typically for either the public or policy experts. So this assumes that they already have some knowledge on the topic. But if you're writing for the public, for example, they may not. So you want to still keep the language really interesting. You want to have colorful language and metaphors, again, relating to what they're interested in, what they know about, what they can relate to, and have timely references, because again, you want to keep your writing relevant to what's going on in the federal policy space. And so it's important to do your research and be knowledgeable about the topic that you're writing. So this is an opportunity for you to express your scientific expertise, again, to somebody who may not be as much of an expert. And as with the memo, but here it's even more important, I think, to grab the reader in the first couple of lines, because this is such a prose type of writing that you can get lost in it. And so you really need to, again, put the bottom line first so that they can relate to what you're saying. Okay, so here's an oped example. So this is slightly different. Would start with a lead, which is essentially an introduction around the news hook. So you can see here it says, the Vermont state legislature passed the law. The reason you care is because Vermont is the first state in the nation to pass such a law, etc. So you're really relating your point to what's going on in the news and what's going on with the Vermont state legislature. So you can hook them right at the start. The thesis, which is a statement of argument, which is essentially you're saying what your argument is, which is either explicit or implied. So it's saying the authors agree that in order for consumers to make informed choices, there needs to be a labeling system. The argument follows that we are concerned that labeling is too simplistic, etc. And then you unpack the argument going through point 1, 2, 3, etc. So first point is that universal labeling for GMO needs to be designed so it does not reduce the items in the grocery store to 2 categories, so it needs to be broad enough. The second point is that there's actually some confusion related to the labels and they need to be easily addressed by the public. And then, so I think it's making really good arguments for the point that you're making. And then at the end, the recommendation, it's saying that we propose a labeling system that highlights GMO diversity, etc. So it's a very good example of how this is sort of unpacked here. And the last part is what they call in this article to be sure paragraph, which is essentially anything where you preempt your potential critics by acknowledging the flaws in the argument and address counter arguments. So again, this doesn't have that in this particular piece, but that's something that you would write, and you can read the paper to see if it's in the paper as well. And then you would sort of finish with a conclusion, which goes back to your introduction as well. So given that, I think this is a good way to unpack this sort of argument, but doesn't have sort of the last part about how you would address flaws in the arguments and how you would address counter arguments. So this is what we're gonna do now for this part. Given what you just saw, what would be a way to address counter arguments or flaws in the argument?
So Adriana, we have a question from Vanessa. Is the to be sure paragraph a response to arguments against what the author is proposing?
So basically, would it be imagining somebody that's opposing your argument, address any potential counter arguments to what you're saying? Also, has also the potential flaws in the argument, because this is very one-sided and saying, here's what we argue, but it's good to be aware of potential flaws as well, or weaknesses in the arguments. So it's kind of getting you to think about that too.
This would be an attempt to remove labeling of GMOs, or rather provide more information on consumers so they can make a choice with more information at hand. So new technologies or advances in GMOs will require continual updating and labeling and transparency to public in these updates. That's really cool. labels are supposed to be simplistic, so shoppers can glance at them while shopping. Including all information for all types of GMO foods would be too complex to put in a single labeling system. Modifying curriculums and programs for STEM education may be too costly during COVID-19 due to budget cuts. Okay, that was related to that. So providing mental health to people who need it is much cheaper than dealing with all the costly consequences of not treating mental illness.
This is kind of trying to get you to think about both sides of a story, even though you're arguing for one side of the policy, but you can always expect that somebody's going to oppose what you're saying. So you need to think about the other side as well, even though you're only arguing for one side. So this is something to keep in mind as you're moving forward in policy as well. Okay, so we'll go through that. So finally, we're going to go through white papers, because this is something that has become, I think, more popular in policy, and it's sort of more, in a way, more academic way of writing, so the way you're used to, but you can really talk about something in depth and expand on that. So you're still making an argument here that you're trying to sway someone to solve a particular problem. It's typically written by students or professionals in specific areas of policy. Again, it's pretty broad. Their purpose is, as I mentioned, to influence decisions, and you're advocating, again, that a certain position is the way to go, or that a certain solution is best for a particular problem. They're typically for a broader audience, also can be either policymakers or members of the public. And here again, you need to demonstrate your research, knowledge, and they should be well researched and technically documented, demonstrating your understanding of the issue at hand. So again, here you're showing your expertise in the topic, and you're informing the audience of what you're saying, but you need to, again, know the background on the issue really well. And the language, again, needs to be accessible, avoiding dense language. And I put this here that you need to have ethics principles. So in a lot of ways, it's similar to an academic paper where you have to write an ethics statement, things like that. And so I think, this is another good way to get started in policy, because you're already used to writing academic papers, but you're writing an argument in a policy sense. So I think it's another really good exercise to do. And so I'm just showing an example here, which you might have seen this one, around state fellowships from JSPG. And I've actually put this in your reading later when we get to that module. But so this is similar to some of the other pieces that I mentioned. There's just going to be a longer write-up, but the summary is very brief. So you can see this is much shorter than before. So you really want to have the reader understand what you're saying pretty quickly. And again, similarly, you would have an executive summary. You would talk about the background. So here in this case, the background and the problem are sort of together. So the background is that there are many state fellowships. They are beginning to emerge as far as more fellowships as opportunities for scientists and engineers locally. But the problem is that they require state-specific fellowship design. And so there's still variability among them. There's going to have to be regulation at the state level of each fellowship, et cetera. So even though it's sort of making the argument that state fellowships are useful, the problem is that they're going to have to be regulated at each state level. And the solutions and recommendations are, we recommend understanding of particular structure needs of state government. So it's a pretty simple argument, but I think it makes the point of, again, what the problem is and what the solutions are that are recommended here. And you would then typically have also appendix and citations. And so as I mentioned, this is more involved and more sort of like a academic paper here. Oops. Sorry, it's not loading for some reason. Okay. So the part of this that I thought would be helpful to think about is, because it's a sort of very straightforward argument of state fellowships, state fellowships are there, but they need to be regulated. And so the question is then, how would you take this to the next level and enact these recommendations, or put these policies in place at the state level? So I wanted to brainstorm a little bit about that and what your thoughts are. More of a balanced view also, in that you're saying, here's all the literature on this topic, right? Just you would write a scientific review, whereas the white paper actually argues for something here. So that's one difference to keep in mind. And when you're writing something, as I mentioned, some things will be sort of, you're making argument on sort of one-sided, but other things will be more balanced, where you're actually presenting both sides.
Okay, so yeah, create a fellowship which is financed by private-public partnership, more like a hybrid model, where government may regulate the resources flow, but execution should be done via private partnership. Ensure that federal agencies will be more than happy and willing to share their success stories with the state governments, and this can be achieved by having desk officer who transmit in the states and transmit these in the states. Thank you. Information in the states. Work on a state-by-state basis. Each will have a different numbers that they can accommodate. Create positions of fellowship if there are none. Partner with city or county governments. Create partnerships between stakeholders that would benefit at the state level from these fellowships. Academic institutions, industry, branches of federal agencies and state locales, and etc. to provide robust training opportunities for fellows. Set aside some funding for fellowship participants. Develop metrics to monitor success of these state-funded fellowship programs, and check in order on them often. Okay. Focus on unique needs of the given state and how a fellowship would be beneficial to these needs. That's a good one. Establish a mentoring plan for fellowship, including learning outcomes for fellows. Create an online repository of information of legislative structures across the states, highlighting similarities and differences between legislators for fellows. Each state establish their own board or agency to regulate science tech fellowships, and these state boards are supported by federal board. Identifying specific hot topics or needs of that state that highlight certain areas where the fellowships, policy fellowships in different fields could be beneficial. This is a really good one. This would vary between states and allow for a variety of opportunities for students. Establish a mixed board or deputy plus academicians, deciding together on how fellowships can be managed. It's sort of like, what we talked in the beginning about a hybrid model. Development of a partnership between public-private, yeah, that's a hybrid model. Create a committee to specialize in these fellowships. Use federal models for policy fellowships as means to create state-level fellowships based on legislators. Connect with individual state Academy of Sciences to set up fellowships. And then there are, yeah, these are the main ones, and the other people are still writing.
Great, those are really good. I think, again, this is the skill that you'll have to gain and do a lot of this. So if you're sort of presented with an issue and then you come up with what the recommendations should be, and this is useful when you're applying for fellowships, so they're going to ask you these things in the application, and also when you're actually in your job and having to do that. So another really good thing to think about, which again came out of this, but I've also been trying to kind of teach you different things with each one.
So while we are at it, Brenna had a question. This white paper example seems like it'll present data from 2 pilot programs. Is that normal for a white paper? But basically, she said, like, is it standard to present or discuss data in a white paper?
Yeah, I think, so this particular paper, I think it has 5 different fellowship types, and I think also compares between them. So I think, again, I guess this one isn't making as much of an argument here, but there may be other examples where you're arguing for a particular side. So I think any of these 3 things that we discussed today need to be data driven. You're just gonna frame it differently depending on what you're writing. That makes sense. And I'll have, as I said, there's gonna be links the last couple a couple of slides for you to look up other examples as well. This is just one that I thought would be easy to go through in the class. Okay, so with that, we're just going to do the last activity now. Given that you've now seen 3 different ways of writing and you have an idea what you want to write about, just sort of thinking about what's the best format for you to write to make the argument that you want to make. Is it a memo, a PED, white paper, or something else? Be any topic. So a lot of times, especially if you're sort of arguing for one side, this can be a response to maybe a federal policy, like what's happening with immigration, for example. Then you will write an oped and say we oppose this or that sort of thing. So they're typically pretty specific to a policy topic. I think, yeah, even white papers, obviously this is broader. I mean, you can think of that as more of an academic kind of writing, but it's still around this, specific topic of state fellowships in this case. So we can have undergrads, grad students, and postdocs can submit. There's a certain limitation after, I think it's within 5 years of graduation, but there's also, so it's sort of a loose definition of early career because obviously there's people that get their PhDs later in life. And so we also consider those in terms of, you're early in your career, but you don't have to be a certain age. Or you can be, or if you're under 30, that also counts. So it's a lot of different ways. And I can send that out later, maybe after with the email.
Yeah.
With specific criteria for JSPG. Yeah.
Yeah, we can add that in the email.
Yeah, so that's all I had. So these last couple of slides have resources, which we're just going to send you in an email or share the slides as well around general science communication. So a lot of the ones I use today are these things. General sort of policy topics overall. The Brown guide is really good. And as I said, you can read the JSPG submission guidelines. ESAP has also toolkits for science communication. And this is for each of the write-ups. So again, there's a lot of resources for each of these things. So these are just a couple that I would recommend to read. The first one here also contains additional resources. And this is a video from one of the science policy groups. I forget which one. And they also talk about how to write a memo. So hopefully these are helpful, and we will sort of have to figure out how to do this. But we're going to try to have people review the pieces that you're going to write throughout the course. So we'll get back to you about that.